So I'm going to call this hearing to order and welcome the members of the Assembly Transportation and Infrastructure Development Committee. I also have I'm Jim Frazier, the chair of the committee, and also want to acknowledge my chair, Assemblymember Asajian, who's the vice chair. Today, the purpose of today's hearing is to provide members of the newly formed committee with a basic understanding on how transportation is funded in California, and to explain why those structures no longer support transportation adequately. I hope that by the end of the hearing, there will be no doubt in any of our minds that we need to do something by this summer. The Assembly Transportation Committee held a similar hearing earlier in the year, so many of the members of this committee, the material may seem familiar. On the other hand, transportation funding is so complicated, we'd probably all do well to hear it again. This committee was formed as a result of the special session called by the governor. Specifically, the governor has asked for legislation to establish permanent pay-as-you-go funding to maintain and repair transportation infrastructure, to fund trade corridor improvements, and to assist local governments financially with their transportation infrastructure needs. I, for one, couldn't be happier that we're in a special session. These tasks are exactly what I came to Sacramento to accomplish, and I'm glad we're finally focusing on them. Mr. Asajian, have you any comments to go forward?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking forward to be working with you and for our colleagues. Glad the governor put this team together with Ms. Atkins, and it's going to be more important than I think it will be. So, and you covered it pretty well. Thank you, and here to work with you.
And I look forward to that collaboration, sir. So let's get right to it. And right now we're going to ask Jessica Peters with the LAO to the table. And we're going to move through today's agenda pretty quickly. I want to thank all the panelists for agreeing to be here today, especially given the short notice of the hearing. And Ms. Peters, welcome, and thank you for being here today. I saw you on Thursday also with the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Jessica Peters with the Legislative Analyst's Office. We have prepared a handout for you that the sergeant is passing out right now. This is similar to a presentation that our office provided to the Assembly Transportation Committee earlier this year, but we've changed it a little bit to focus in on funding for highways and roads, which is the focus of the special session.
Thank you.
On page 1 of the handout, we have a summary for you of the state's major highway and road programs, what those programs do, and sort of the overall level of funding for those programs for the 15-16 fiscal year. I'll just run briefly through each of these programs. First, the Highway Maintenance Program. This is a program administered by Caltrans. The program is responsible for performing routine maintenance such as so routine maintenance such as restriping, as well as other minor repairs, replacing light bulbs, litter removal, those types of things. The program also funds, what we want to draw your attention to is about $200 million of minor maintenance projects. These are sort of thin overlays on pavements, projects that will protect the state's pavements, as well as bridge projects as well. The state also has the SHOT program, or the State Highway Operation and Protection Program. This program is also administered by Caltrans. Funding for the program is about $2.3 billion for 15-16. And this program really is funding more major capital projects to really reconstruct portions of the state's highways that have deteriorated significantly and can no longer be just simply maintained, but really need to be rebuilt. The state also has a State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP program. Funding for this program is only about $300 million in revenues allocated for 15-16. This program traditionally was the program that funded capacity expansion of the state's transportation systems, either state highways, intercity rail. The funding can be used for local road as well as some transit projects. Funding, as I said, is only about $300 million for 15-16. This is a lot less than it has been in prior years, and so that's not a whole lot of money in terms of actually, building new infrastructure. As you know, transportation projects are expensive. And the last program is the Local Streets and Roads program, and essentially the state shares a portion of its revenues with cities and counties to fund their local systems. For the 15-16 year, this is about $1.4 billion. Page 2 of the handout, we have a pie chart on this page that sort of describes the total level and breakdown of where the state's highway and road taxes and fees come from. As you can see in the figure, about 3/4 of the revenues come from excise taxes on gasoline, and another share comes from excise taxes on diesel, as well as about $1 billion each year from vehicle weight fees. So the remainder of the handout gets into more detail about each of these revenue sources and how the funds from these revenue sources are allocated to the programs that we summarize on that first page. Page 3 of the handout gives you more detail on gasoline excise tax revenues. The state has 2 excise taxes on gasoline, a base rate of 18 cents, as well as a variable gasoline excise tax, which for the 15-16 year is set at the rate of 12 cents per gallon. The base 18 cents is expected to generate about $2.5 billion for the 15-16 year, and the variable rate is expected to generate about $1.7 billion. If you turn to page 4 of the handout, this shows where these funds go from the excise tax on gasoline. The base 18 cents is divided 2/3 between the state and 1/3 with cities and counties for their local streets and roads. For 15-16, this amounts to about $1.7 billion to the state. This money goes into the state highway account and is used to fund a variety of purposes, including Caltrans administration, as well as the highway maintenance program and SHOP programs that I described earlier. The third for cities and counties is distributed by formula for their streets and roads. The variable 12-cent excise tax is distributed in a little bit more complicated of a manner. It's also a formula, but as you can see, the picture shows the distribution. Essentially, the revenue comes in from this, and off the top, before any money is divvied up between transportation programs, there is a certain amount, about $1 billion, that comes off the top to backfill for the use of weight fee revenues, which I'll talk about in just a moment, which go to pay debt service on transportation bonds. So you can essentially think of this weight fee backfill portion of the chart as assisting the general fund in paying for transportation bonds.
Jessica, could you also tell us before July 1st, what the variable fee was?
I think it was 18 cents. It was just revised downward, and so the Board of Equalization will adjust that each year depending on what the state would have collected if we would have had a sales tax on gasoline instead of an excise tax on gasoline. And then there's also a true-up, and so that does cause some of those fluctuations, including the drop from about 18 cents down to 12 cents.
Which was at about a cost of about $900 million, I believe, from what I understand, a reduction in revenue?
That sounds about right.
Okay, thank you.
So the funds that remain after the weight fee backfill are split 44% to cities and counties for their streets and roads, 44% to the State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP, and 12% to the SHOP. To give you some context, given the lower rate that was mentioned, for the 15-16 year, the 44% to cities and counties will generate just a little over $300 million in total for that distribution to locals. Page 5 of the handout summarizes the state's fuel taxes on diesel. In particular, the excise tax on diesel is what is used to fund highways and roads. As you can see in the gas pump figure, the state also has sales tax on diesel. There's actually 2 different sales taxes on diesel. These go to fund transit, and so we don't have a lot of detail on them here, but if you have questions, we're happy to answer that. The excise tax on diesel is set at 13 cents for the 15-16 year. This rate also varies and is set by the Board of Equalization, which is expected to generate about $440 million for the current year that just started. These excise tax revenues are used in a similar manner as the base gas tax, with the first 6 cents of the funds going to cities and counties for their streets and roads, and the remainder of the revenues being deposited into the state highway account for Caltrans administration, the highway maintenance program, and the SHOP program. So the last state revenue source that we want to describe for you is on page 6 and 7 of the handout. And this is vehicle weight fees. These are essentially registration fees that are charged to heavy vehicles that drive on the state's roadways, such as commercial trucks. And this revenue source generates about $1 billion each year. You can see in the figure the total bar in the figure is the total amount of revenues. The dark shaded part and the light shaded part represent how these revenues have been used in recent years. So the dark shaded part of the bar shows how much of the weight fee revenues have been used to offset debt service costs on eligible transportation bonds, so essentially paying off projects that the state has funded through a financing mechanism. The light shaded part of the bar shows amount of funds that were loaned to the general fund. These loans, when they are repaid in the future, will actually be used to pay future debt service. And so under current law, you want to think about these loans as sort of paying for future debt service and not necessarily being repaid to transportation to fund new projects, really rather to pay off the financing of projects that were already built.
Do you have a total dollar figure? Dollar figure from the loan amount from that went to general fund?
Sure. So this use of the weight fee revenues has been since the fuel tax swap, and since that time it's about $1.4 billion in weight fee revenues that have been loaned to the general fund, and none of them have been repaid yet, but they would be repaid under current law in a future year when they're needed to pay debt service if that level of debt service goes higher. So essentially, the amount of eligible debt service will go to pay current weight fees will go to pay current eligible debt service, and any amount above that will be loaned under current law. And then when the amount of debt service is higher, then those loans will be repaid, but then go back to benefit the general fund by offsetting those future debt costs. So essentially all of these revenues under current law are dedicated towards paying off financing.
Ms. Zegman, you have a question?
Just for historical purposes, can you tell me when each of these fees was instituted?
For each specific source, we can get back to you. I, off the top of my head, don't know. The state has had all of these revenues in place for a very long time. The state has an excise tax on gasoline for decades. Mm-hmm. We can follow up on each of the specific sources, but they've been around for a very long time.
Ms. Segman, I think the gas tax started in 1923.
1923?
Yeah.
And the weight?
We'll look up the weight fee.
Is there a long-term schedule of debt that we can kind of take a look at some point that kind of suggests how far out this goes? Different bonds that have been extended for transportation?
Yeah, I believe that the administration has a forecast of that we can share with the committee on how much they expect, how quickly they expect to sell bonds, and how much the debt service would be on those. Essentially, what this is paying for is prior voter-approved bonds, primarily Proposition 1B. So we can follow up with you with some more information on how much has been sold and how much is left to be sold, and what those estimates are.
What's the Prop 1B? Somewhere around $6 billion.
Proposition 1B was just under $20 billion.
That's the long-term nature.
Correct. The state is also still paying some.
I think what he's also looking for is probably what percentage of transportation debt is obligated by the general fund. Thank you. Proceed, Jessica, please.
So then if you turn to page 8 and page 9 of the handout, so sort of shifting gears a little bit, we have some information for you given the context of the special session and the interest in increasing funding for transportation. We've laid out some different options for the legislature to increase funding for transportation. We have a table on page 8 that you might find helpful. This lays out some of the existing state fuel and vehicle taxes, most of which currently go to fund transportation that I just talked about. We also have the vehicle license fee on there that currently is charged by the state but doesn't go to fund transportation, but is something that I think people have been talking about, so included that there for you. You can see in the table that sort of as a frame of reference, each 1 cent increase in the gasoline excise tax, for example, will generate about $150 million. A 1% increase in the vehicle license fee would generate about $3 to $3.5 billion. And so that can give you some sense of how much revenue each of these different sources could generate. So one option, obviously, for the legislature is to increase these existing fees or taxes. And then on page 9 of the handout, we have some other options as well. The legislature could charge new fees or taxes that it currently doesn't charge. The state previously had a sales tax on gasoline, and if the state were to charge one in the future, those funds would be required under the Constitution to go for certain transportation purposes. That is one thing the state could do. The state could also charge a road usage charge or fee, which is something that legislation was passed last year to do a pilot study to evaluate. Maybe a little soon to do that, but in terms of longer term solutions, that might be an option to consider. The state could also use other existing state revenues. The state legislature could dedicate general fund revenues or spend general fund revenues for transportation if that was a priority. The legislature could also potentially allocate cap and trade auction revenues to meet its transportation needs in a manner consistent with the requirements on the uses of those funds. And lastly, we would just note that there's some outstanding transportation loans that could be repaid and sort of provide an additional one-time infusion of funds for transportation. We list here in the handout $900 million in outstanding loans that are required under current statute to be repaid to fund transportation projects. In addition, there's the $1.4 billion in wheat fee loans that I spoke about a few minutes ago. We don't list that in the total here because under current law, those would just go to pay for financing of projects that have already been built, but that is just a statutory requirement. It would be within the legislature's ability to make changes to that as you're considering total funding. So happy to answer any questions on background on transportation funding or programs or the options.
Thank you. I see Mr. Sajian has a question.
Thank you, Ms. Peters. On page 8, when you came up with these figures, did you consider the newer cars traveling longer per gallon and or more electrical cars on the road?
So certainly having some sort of registration fee or user fee that is maybe akin to a registration fee is something the legislature could do. It's something that you could either set a flat rate for all vehicles, or you could have a different rate or a specific fee for certain types of vehicles, such as electric vehicles or really high efficiency vehicles. The table isn't necessarily intended to be an exhaustive list, but more just to give you a sense. If that's something the committee's interested in, we're happy to see.
Thank you.
Any other questions of Jessica? Seeing none, thank you so much for your presentation in the future. So we're going to move on to Stephen Keck, with Chief Budget Officer for the California Department of Transportation. Stephen, thank you for coming today on short notice.
Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Keck, the Chief Budget Officer for Caltrans, and I'm going to talk today about excise taxes in particular in California, go through a little bit of history of the excise taxes, and then talk about where we are today and where we think we're going to go in the future with excise taxes and some of the challenges that we have with them. Oh, you know what? I don't have the clicker.
Do now.
So the Legislative Analyst's Office did a good job of giving an overview of these excise taxes on gasoline and diesel. So I'm not going to belabor this point, but I do want to point out and remind everyone that an excise tax is a tax on a unit of something sold. In this case, we're talking about a gallon of gasoline. So all of the taxes that we have to fund transportation infrastructure are all based on charging for a gallon of gasoline. And these rates are the same as were discussed by the analysts in the last speaker, so I won't go over them again. But this is sort of another look at how those taxes fit together in terms of how we collect them and how they're distributed through current law. So when you buy a gallon of gas, you pay about 60 cents per gallon in taxes in California. 18 cents are that base excise tax that we've already talked about. 12 cents per gallon is for the price-based excise tax that replaced sales tax. The federal government charges 18.4 cents per gallon. And then depending on what county you're in, you pay local sales taxes, and the rates vary. We've used an average of about 10 cents a gallon for this chart. In some cities and counties, you'll pay more because they have special sales tax rates that apply to gasoline. But that's about 18% of the total taxes that you pay on a gallon of gas. The way that it's broken down, you see off the top, or not necessarily off the top, but about 10% of these revenues go to pay for backfilling of late fees, which are taken for debt service. About 44% of the funding goes to state highways for rehabilitation of the state highway system, for maintenance of the state highway system, and for operation of that system. About 28% goes to local agencies for transportation, and that's a very unusually low percentage this year, and I'll talk about that later on. And about 18% is that sales tax, that local sales tax equivalent. In some cases, it's used for transportation purposes. In other cases, it's used for general fund purposes. So here's the history of the excise tax rates, and for the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about just the base 18-cent sales or excise tax on gasoline, because that's really what funds rehabilitation and maintenance of the state highway system in California. So we had our first excise tax in 1923. It was 2 cents at that time, which was a lot of money in 1923. Since 1923, there's only been 6 actions to increase that tax, only 6 times. The last time was in 1990. Proposition 111 increased that excise tax from 9 cents a gallon to 14 cents a gallon, and it caused 4 1-cent successive increases the next 4 years till we got to our current rate, which you can't see on the screen, but it is on your handouts. It was increased in 1994 to 18 cents per gallon. That's been 21 years now. It's worth noting that gap of 21 years is the longest gap between tax rate changes. It also happens to be longer than the time that the Model A Ford was introduced in 1903 and the first tax in California in 1923. So kind of an interesting comparison. When we talk about tax rates over time, though, one thing that's also useful to talk about is inflation and the impact on that tax. So this graph that we see here, I should have done that. This graph that we see here shows along the bottom that same base excise tax rate that was in the previous chart. And then the green line that squiggles up and down there is that same tax rate adjusted for inflation. We see a couple of things on this chart. The first thing that you see is in the past, especially around the 50s and 60s, that period of time where we often refer to as the heyday of highway construction and of highway infrastructure building. That was in the 50s and 60s. That tax rate was worth a lot of money in terms of inflation. And then we see in the 1970s, beginning with the first oil embargo in 1973 and 74, oil prices quadrupled in the course of 3 months. Inflation, especially with relation to constructing our highways, which uses a lot of oil, shot through the roof, and the value of that tax dropped correspondingly. And you had another oil embargo in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, caused that second big steep drop you see there in the value of that excise tax. And then as we look forward past 1994, that last time that the gas tax was changed, we can see that the value of that tax rate is less than half of what it was in 1994 when it was set, when we adjust for inflation. So inflation is one of the challenges that we face with this fuel source. With this revenue source, and another one is increasing fuel economy. So this chart is, if you may have seen this before, it's recently been revised based on some input we've received. What we've done here is we've indexed these two totally different things with totally different number sets so that they both start at the same place in 1994. And what we have with the blue line is the growth in the vehicle miles traveled across the state. It's about 325 billion miles a year. And then the orange line shows gasoline consumption. So beginning around 2003, 2004, we started to see that these things were growing or changing at different rates over time. And more recently, especially after the beginning of the Great Recession in 2008, we start to see a significant divergence. So although VMT was growing, albeit much slower than it has in the past, we started to see consumption drop pretty dramatically. The dotted line is looking forward. So as cars get more fuel efficient, the gap between the miles traveled and the consumption of fuel increases, which means the gap in funding increases. The current federal CAFE standards, that's the corporate average fuel economy standards, dictate that a small sedan sold in 2025, it's 10 years from now, should average 55 miles to the gallon. That's more than twice the average fuel economy of a car on the road today. And it's going to cause this gap to get wider, and it's going to accelerate the divergence of these two lines. So conceptually, while better fuel economy is fantastic for air quality, it's fantastic for your pocketbook when you go to fill up your car, it's terrible when it comes to funding transportation. As I promised, I'm now going to switch back to talking about the price-based excise tax. And again, the analyst did a good job of explaining how this works. Sales tax on gasoline has been collected since 1971. And starting in 2000, that sales tax was dedicated to transportation. But in 2010, the state did this swap where we eliminated sales tax on gasoline and replaced it with an excise tax that was adjusted annually to maintain revenue neutrality. So as the price of gasoline goes up and down, the rate is adjusted accordingly. But it's not adjusted concurrently. So what we end up with, as was mentioned before, is sometimes we have to make adjustments for assumptions that were made in the past. And that's going to have a significant impact that I'll talk about in the next slide. But at the same time that we did the fuel tax swap, we also did the weight fee swap. And that is where weight fees that were going to the state highway account are now being used to pay transportation debt service on transportation bonds. And then the off-the-top portion of this new price-based tax is used to pay to backfill for that weight fees. And I have a chart on the next page that helps explain that a little bit. So the remaining amount after you take the off the top of the weight fees is split 44, 44, 12, as was described in the last presentation. And what we end up with is this sort of series of the tax rates since it was put into place in 2010-11. For the first 4 years, or the first 3 years, you saw very minor increases as gas was sort of ticking along at $4 a gallon. We saw a pretty significant increase in 13-14, up to 21.5 cents per gallon. 14-15 rate dropped down to 18 cents a gallon. And the new tax rate that was just put into place a few days ago, 12 cents a gallon. So the impact of that can best be described on these two slides, or these two pie graphs, which is the last slide of my presentation. These are the last 2 years on this chart. So taking these last 2 years here and showing them in a different way. As you can see on this chart, the amount of debt service, which is the dark part of these little lines, hasn't changed much over the last 5 years, but the total tax has. So, and I apologize, it doesn't appear to be showing up properly here in the presentation, but it is printed properly in your handout. The weight fees are this darker circle, or the darker part of the pie here. They haven't changed much, but the total size of the pie has changed. So we went from about $2.5 billion in total revenue at 18 cents a gallon in the 14-15 year to an estimated $1.7 billion in gas tax collections at 12 cents a gallon. That's a 33% drop in revenue, almost but not quite $900 million. It's $800 and some odd million. So what that does is it focuses all of the change in the tax rate in these three areas, which are for new projects. So local roads, for example, last year received $680 million. This year, they're projected to receive $297 million. Now, you'll note that's almost 60% decrease. So even though the total collections the state brings in is only down 33%, the amount that goes out to new projects is down 60%. And the same can be said for capacity improvements through the State Transportation Improvement Program, also going from 680 down to 297. And the piece of this that's available for rehabilitation goes from 185 million down to 81 million. So very significant changes as a result of the current tax structure we have. And a lot of this reduction from 18 cents a gallon down to 12 cents a gallon is related to the fact that the gas tax is only changed once per year, whereas the sales tax varied every day with the price of gasoline. So that in and of itself causes a fairly unpredictable structure that can lead to this sort of problematic drop-off in revenue. And with that, I'm going to end here because I know your next speaker is going to speak about volatility and how that impacts projects and also overall problems with not having enough money for transportation projects. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Stephen. Any questions of the committee of our panelists? Mr. Gatto.
Just real quick, you talked a lot about inflation. Would it make sense to, whatever we come up with, and believe me, we're very far away from that, from doing some sort of inflation linking in that?
Yeah, certainly there are